Okay, this video series is going to be entitled Picketts Charge, and this is our first part. Now, around 1:03 p.m. on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, two cannon fired a shot eastward, which began the cannonade of Picketts Charge. Around 3 p.m., following a 2-hour cannonade, the Confederate infantry would then launch a massive frontal assault from this ridge that we're standing on against the center of the Union line, which was directly in front of us along a stone wall. The Confederates who comprised this section of the line were Virginians under the command of Major General George E. Pickett. Now, these Southern Confederate attackers, which were about 12,000 strong, moved forward in a battle line about 1 mile. As they marched across the Emmitsburg Road and approached the Union line, the Federals then began to rake them with canister and musket fire. Nevertheless, without the courage of these men, the Southerners continued to press on. Pickett's men gained a small lodgment in the Union line at the angle, but could not hold it, as the casualties began to mount and the attack lost its momentum. By 4 o'clock, Confederate survivors came streaming back to the shelter of this ridge, and the Confederate tide had reached what we call the high water mark of the Confederacy. And in this video series, we will talk about different aspects of Pickett's Charge. This has been part 1 of Picketts Charge here on Gettysburg Battlefield. Okay, this is going to be Picketts Charge part 2 here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And we are standing here at the Virginia Memorial. This memorial was dedicated on June the 6th, 1917, and it features Major General Robert Edward Lee mounted on his favorite horse, Traveler. Underneath the statue is a group who represents different types who left the civil occupation to join the Confederate Army as Virginians. From left to right, it is a professional man, a mechanic, an artist, a boy, a businessman, a farmer, and a youth. The sculptor of this monument was a man named F.W. Severs, and again, this monument was dedicated on June the 6th, 1917. It was one of the first of the what would later become a Confederate monuments on the battlefield dedicated to the states that fought for the Confederacy during the American Civil War here at the Battle of Gettysburg. The likeness of Robert E. Lee is often considered to be one of the best representations of Robert E. Lee that's ever been sculpted. And again, it sits here on the ridge where General Lee sat atop of his horse, Traveler, and watched as the 12,000 soldiers under Major General Pickett participated in what we would know as Pickett's Charge as they crossed this field over here. This has been Pickett's Charge Part 2 on Gettysburg Battlefield. Hey, this is going to be Pickett's Charge Part 3 on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. We're going to point out some vantage points standing here along the ridge of the charge of Pickett's Charge. And I'm going to use my finger to point them out. Over here, to our left, you see this group of trees here. This was known as Ziegler's Grove, which was one of the more prominent landmarks on Cemetery Ridge. The Confederate Army directed their attack against the section of the Union line that ran from Ziegler's Grove here to the copse of trees. So this first vantage point is Ziegler's Grove. The second one that we're going to look at is actually the Emmitsburg Road. And the Emmitsburg Road can be hard to see, but you see the Bryan farm that I'm pointing at, and every once in a while you'll actually see a car go by the Emmitsburg Road. That was the Emmitsburg Road. The Confederate Army, of course, would cross that road, and then that is where basically they would stop being shot at by cannonade, but then they would start being at a closer range shot by musket, and also by cannon with grape shot and canister. So that's the Emmitsburg Road right there. Our next is going to be right over here where you see this one tree standing by itself, and that would be the angle. And it's there where a stone wall makes a 90-degree turn that the Confederates broke through the Union line at the angle right here. And of course, though they did have a breakthrough, it was defeated, and then they were beaten back across the field. The fourth vantage point would be the center of attack. General Lee wanted to attack the center of the Union line here at what we call the copse of trees, or also known as the clump of trees. If we move a little bit to our left, we're going to look at this fifth spot right up here in the distance, and this is called the Point of Woods. The Point of Woods was a wood line that ran here also with a 90-degree angle. And when Picketts Charge was over and the Southern troops came coming back toward this ridge, this was the area that General Robert E. Lee mounted on Traveler, then rode along the Point of Woods. Today there's a sidewalk that goes out, and he met his retreating troops as they came across the field to console them at the Point of Woods. So that would be our fifth vantage point here on our Picketts Charge series. And we'll go back and watch and shoot videos at all these points on the other side of the line there at a later time. This has been part 3 of Picketts Charge here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Picketts Charge Part 4 here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate, and I'm here at the Point of Woods looking over the fields of Picketts Charge. And now as the Confederates streamed back across the field after their failed attack, Major General Robert Edward Lee rode out to this point where he met his troops, and he was heard to have said that the attack had all been his fault. Now, this attack cost his army about 6,000 casualties. With the failure of the charge, General Lee knew that his opportunity for a victory here at Gettysburg was gone. His men were exhausted, and the number of the dead, wounded, and the missing was enormous. They could no longer take the offensive, and they began to think in different terms about retreating. And on July 4th, Lee's men held their position on the ridge that's behind us, and the Federals did not attack them at that point. That evening, General Robert E. Lee would be given the order to the rest of his army to retreat from Gettysburg, officially ending the Battle of Gettysburg. The retreat began in a very heavy rain that had started on the evening of July 3rd, 1863, around 8:30 p.m. This rain soaked the downcast Southern troops, and the high spirits that had carried them into Pennsylvania were dashed on the bloody fields of Gettysburg. One of the stories that I want to tell is that of Lieutenant Thomas C. Holland. Now, he commanded Company G of the 28th Virginia Infantry. Shouting, "Come on, boys," Holland broke through the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. He fell moments later when a bullet pierced his cheek and exited the back of his head. He was carried to a Union field hospital and later recovered. Of the 88 men in Company G of the 28th Virginia who took part in Pickett's Charge, 81 of the 88 were listed as killed, wounded, or missing that night. 50 years after the battle, Holland returned to the spot where he fell and shook the hand of a Union soldier that had shot him. This has been Pickett's Charge Part 4 here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Okay, this is going to be Part 5 of our video series called Pickett's Charge here on Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. And we're going to talk about the soldiers, the Confederate soldiers that made this charge and their location. Here in the distance would have been Wilcox, and Wilcox under his command had the 9th, 10th, 11th, 8th, and 14th Alabama. Behind him, over beyond the Henry Spangler farm, would have been Kemper, who would have been anchored basically right in front of the Spangler farm there, and he would have had the 24th, 11th, 1st, 7th, and 3rd Virginia. Lang and his Floridians would have been out front with the 5th, the 8th, and the 2nd Florida. And then just on this side of the Spangler farm, which you can see on the left center of our camera, just a little bit to the right, where you see those two prominent trees right over here, would have been Garnett's Virginia's brigade, which would have been the 8th, the 18th, the 19th, the 28th, and the 56th Virginia. That would have made the the right of the Confederate line here during Pickett's Charge. This has been Pickett's Charge Part 5 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This is going to be Pickett's Charge Part 6 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and we're looking at the placement of Confederate troops during the action of Pickett's Charge. Here where our camera's facing, behind the trees here, would have been Armistead's brigade, which consisted of the 14th, the 9th, the 53rd, the 57th, and the 38th Virginia Infantry. And of course, Armistead's brigade would then move out here in this direction and over toward the copse of trees and the angle. The brigade of Lawrence would have been over here and would have been consisting of the 16th, 22nd, 34th, 13th, and 38th North Carolina. That would have been over here in the distance today where the North Carolina Brigade is. Also, just to his right would have been Fry's brigade under the command of Burkett D. Fry, which was originally Burkett's brigade. The 1st Tennessee, 13th Alabama, 14th Tennessee, 7th Tennessee, and 5th Alabama Battalion. That would be today where the Tennessee Monument is, in between the Tennessee Monument and the North Carolina Monument. And we did take a little look at that in our video series, the 13th Alabama at Gettysburg. These troops, of course, were under Trimble's command, and we will take a look at a little bit more of that line in our next video. This has been Pickett's Charge Part 6 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This is going to be Pickett's Charge Part 7 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and we're going to take a look at the extreme left of the Pickett's Charge line, the troops under Pettigrew, and also that were here on Seminary Ridge. And we're going to look at the battalion under Lane, the 7th, 37th, 28th, 18th, and 33rd North Carolina was Lane's brigade. In front of him would have been Marshall, 52nd North Carolina, 47th North Carolina, 26th North Carolina, 11th North Carolina. Davis's Brigade, 11th Mississippi, 42nd Mississippi, 55th North Carolina, 2nd Mississippi, Brockenball, 22nd Virginia, 40th Virginia, 47th Virginia, and 55th Virginia. And of course, those troops there under Pettigrew on the extreme left would make up what we know as the Pettigrew and Trimble charge, which would go over here to the left side looking at the angle. The Pettigrew Trimble charge going in this direction here with those troops that I just mentioned a moment ago. And again, this is a basic makeup. It doesn't include all the artillery and movement of the troops, but this is the makeup of the 12,000 soldiers under the command of George E. Pickett that left this Seminary Ridge here on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, and made this famous charge across the field, all converging on that spot there in the center of our camera that we would know as Picketts Charge. Of course, this charge has also been called the Pickett Pettigrew Trimble Charge. It's also been called Longstreet's Assault. But its name it's most famous for and known by is Picketts Charge. And again, these troops were under the command of Major General George E. Pickett. It happened here on July 3rd, 1863. It was one of the most deadly actions of the American Civil War. And it resulted in the destruction of Pickett's men here with over 6,000 casualties in just a couple of hours here. This has been part 6 or 7. I'm sorry, part 7 of Pickett's Charge here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Okay, this is going to be Pickett's Charge part 8 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And anyone who comes out here and walks the fields of Pickett's Charge has to feel something. I do want to mention that a soldier from the 11th Virginia had made a quote. And of course, the 11th Virginia was under Kemper's command in Pickett's division. And they would have been in this direction, charging across the field here toward the copse of trees. And this soldier, his name was Lieutenant John T. James of the 11th Virginia. And after the war, he stated, "We gained nothing but glory and lost our bravest men." This field here of Pickett's Charge on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, though it does look pretty the same today. It has been altered differently, and it did look different on that afternoon. First off, over here on the left would have been the smoldering ruins of the Bliss Farm. And of course, we did a video series on the Bliss Farm, and not many people realize that a large barn and a farm sat over here, right here on the fields of Pickett's Charge. And that barn was hotly contended for on the afternoons of July 2nd and 3rd of 1863. It was set on fire by Union troops. It's one of the only farms destroyed by Union troops during the battle here. And this field would have been not only filled with the smoke of artillery and musket fire, but with the burning of that farm, you know, the burning of high grass and fields from hot shells landing in it. And this farm, in several locations today, and the ground goes down into dips, as you can see here. And that's why at the beginning, as you see the copse of trees, as they start to disappear at our camera as we continue to get down into one of these dips. So as these Confederate soldiers are walking and marching across these fields on July 3rd, 1863, they go through periods as they go into these little swales that go up and down in the ground, and they're still that way today, where they had periods of protection. And that is why which you cannot see the Emmitsburg Road at this point as you could back there along the ridge. That is why the deadliest fighting was when they came out of these swales and entered the Emmitsburg Road. Then they did not have the protection from the artillery any longer, and they were under canister fire from artillery, and now musket fire would rake their ranks and destroy their ranks. I think it is important to come out here and walk across these fields and get a feel for the ground. And back in 1863, the fields had more dips, because if you remember, after the Civil War in the early 1900s, this was also used as Camp Colt, a World War I training camp, and they actually had tanks out here on the ground which had flattened and destroyed some of the landscape of the original Picketts Charge battlefield here. This has been part 8 of Picketts Charge here in the middle of the field of Picketts Charge here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.